Hello, everyone. This is Francisca Blanc with Utah Housing Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday for our monthly meeting. Tara Rollins, the Executive Director, is also attending the webinar. And the guest speaker for today is Sarah Saidian. She is with National Low Income Housing Coalition, and we asked her to speak on what's happening in Washington, D.C. currently, because we as professionals, we get the email alerts from the national organizations, or we have direct contact with our delegation, and then you read the press. So something is secure for one day, the next day is changing. And so I spoke with Sarah a little bit before starting the meeting and kind of let her know the climate in Utah as far as, the rental assistance through HUD and also the rental assistance through CARES Act that has to be spent by the end of December, and kind of also inform her about the outreach we as a community were trying to do about the CDC moratorium. I would like to ask Sarah to give us an update. Thank you so much and welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I just want to start off a little bit with letting you guys know a little bit more about the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We're based in Washington, D.C., and our focus is on ensuring that people with the very lowest incomes have access to affordable, decent, and accessible housing. We do this work in a couple of different ways. We educate members of Congress about policy solutions and about the needs that are out in the country. We mobilize our membership, including Utah Housing Coalition and its partners, so that we can hopefully build the political will for solutions. And we help shape the conversation through our communication strategy. We engage with media and do our best to try to help frame the issue in the public space. So that's sort of a little bit about our organization. What makes us different than other groups in DC is that we're not a trade association, so we don't represent any particular piece of the housing industry. We are purely focused on our mission, which is serving the lowest income people. And so our members kind of run the gamut from homelessness and homeless service providers, housing providers, housing advocates, low-income people, and people experiencing homelessness. So we have a really broad array of members, organizations, and so just a little insight about where we're coming from. So as many of you guys know, since even before the pandemic, we were dealing with a housing crisis. This housing crisis disproportionately was harming people with the very lowest incomes. We know this based on research that we have done and research of other organizations. One of our reports that we put out annually is called the GAP report, and that report documents the shortage of housing across the country by income group. And you can see here that we're bringing up the Utah information about what your housing situation is like in your state. And you can see, if you scroll down a little bit more, you can see that for every 100 families that are in Utah who are extremely low income, keep going down, there are only 31 homes affordable and available to them. That shortage means that the other 69 of the 100 households don't have any options that are available to them that they can afford. They really have no choice but to live in housing where they have to pay 50, 60, 70% of their income on rent. And when they do that and they have such limited incomes to begin with, it means that any sort of financial shock could push them over the edge so that they fall behind on their rent and they are at risk of eviction and, in worst cases, homelessness. And really, if we want to solve this housing crisis, the best and most efficient way to do that is to really address the needs of people who have the very lowest incomes. So for many people, this pandemic has been that event that is putting so many more households at risk of eviction. We estimate, and along with our partners from other academic institutions, that somewhere between 30 million and 40 million renters are going to be at risk of losing their homes by the end of the year. And those households are predominantly people with the lowest incomes and people of color. And that's because those were the households that were most at risk prior to the pandemic, and those are the households most bearing the brunt of the pandemic in terms of the health consequences, but also resulting job losses as well. We are in the midst of pushing for important resources in a sort of relief package, any relief package that we can get that can help address some of these needs. I know that many of you guys have already been working to use resources from the CARES Act, like your Coronavirus Relief Fund dollars or HUD resources to help address these needs. We were really helpful that we were able to secure about $12 billion in housing and homelessness resources through the CARES Act, but we also know that there is so much more need out there, and that we need a lot more. So just to give you a sense, I want before I talk a little bit about where things stand in terms of negotiations, I did want to share a little bit about what our main priorities are for this relief package and why it is that we're pushing for them. So the first and most important thing that we are pushing for is a national uniform moratorium on evictions. We know that many states and localities have passed their own eviction moratoriums, but those moratoriums are quickly expiring. And the moratorium that was in the CARES Act, while really important, it only covered about 30% of all renters. And there was a lot of difficulties that renters faced in trying to figure out whether or not they were covered or not. So there are definitely some issues there. We were happy to see that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, issued its moratorium, which is a nationwide moratorium. It applies to nearly all renters and allows them to avoid evictions for non-payment of rent through the end of the year. So that expires December 31st. But there are some challenges with that moratorium. The first challenge is that in order to be protected, renters need to take an affirmative step in order to be covered. So they have to sign a declaration form saying that they are eligible, and they need to provide it to their landlord. But a lot of renters don't know that this moratorium exists, and they don't necessarily know the steps that they need to take. And so the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and Utah Housing Coalition and other folks are doing whatever we can do to really spread the word about the eviction moratorium to let renters know so that they can stay in their homes. We have resources on our website if you ever need them. We have FAQs about what the eviction moratorium covers, and we also have sample declaration forms that renters can use in about 13 languages, and then we have a link to a HUD resource that has it in 20 languages. So if there's a language that you do not find that you need, you should let us know, and we can make sure that we get it translated, because we want to make this as accessible as possible. There is some evidence that the CDC moratorium is working. We have seen overall eviction rates are going down, but we're also seeing another trend, which is that typically the largest institutional or corporate landlords are moving very quickly to file for eviction before renters know about these protections. So we've seen a huge spike among institutional landlords moving forward with these evictions. We've raised this issue with federal agencies, and we're urging them to take action to tamp down on that. But that's something that's really deeply concerning to us. That's why in a relief package, we're pushing for a different moratorium that would help address some of those shortfalls with the CDC moratorium. So the one that was in the HEROES Act that was passed by Democrats in the summer, that moratorium is a little bit better than the CDC moratorium because it wouldn't require renters to take any affirmative steps. It would be automatic, and it would last longer. It would provide assistance for another 12 months or 12 months of protections. So there's some really good pieces to that. But we know that an eviction moratorium on its own isn't enough to prevent evictions. It really just postpones evictions unless we see Congress pass emergency rental assistance. We estimate that over the next 12 months, $100 billion in emergency rental assistance is needed. And we've been able to work with Democrats in the House to ensure that their HEROES Act included $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, and trying to work on the Senate side too to encourage, especially Republicans, to be open to the idea of emergency rental assistance also. This is really important because we know we're tracking state and local rental assistance programs that have been stood up or expanded during the pandemic. We have about 350 state and local programs that we're tracking, and that's really impressive to see how quickly states and local governments are moving, but they are running out of resources. Of those 350 programs, about a third or 35% have already run out of money, and that's because the need for assistance is just overwhelming the resources that state and local governments have to do this work. Yeah, so that's a big challenge, and it points to the need for a federal solution and for federal resources. And those two things, a moratorium and rental assistance, will really do a lot of good in preventing those 30 to 40 million households from losing their homes. The third major piece of what we're pushing for in the next relief package is resources for people who are experiencing homelessness. So we know that when you're living in congregate settings, whether it's shelters or in homeless encampments, it's very difficult to practice the CDC guidelines for social distancing, which means that there is a public health threat to keeping people in those conditions. There is a large effort underway across the country to help move people who are experiencing homelessness into hotels and motels so that they can safely self-isolate and quarantine. But a lot more resources are needed in order to allow them to do that. We estimate that in total, $15.5 billion is needed to address the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness. The CARES Act provided about $4 billion, but there's still $11.5 billion that remain that are needed there. It's also really important to recognize that people who are experiencing homelessness often have underlying health conditions that mean that they're more likely to have severe responses to COVID, they're more likely to be hospitalized, and they're more likely to pass away from the illness than the general public. And so it's a very vulnerable population at higher risk for severe illness and death that we need to be very conscious of. All of those elements are included in the HEROES Act. We have a lot of support from Democratic leadership in both the House and the Senate, which is really great. But we've been dismayed by how long it has taken Congress to negotiate a relief package. Congress, especially Senate Republicans, waited for a really long time to even start negotiations, if you remember this. So the House passed their bill, I believe, in early May. It wasn't until late July, before they left for August recess, that Republicans started to engage in these negotiations. They wanted to take a wait-and-see approach. They wanted to see how the economy was recovering at first. But there wasn't enough time or will to get a deal done by August recess, and the Congress went back to their districts, went back to their states without a deal in hand. We were really hoping to see something once they came back in early September. But again, negotiations saw a lot of fits and starts. More recently, though, we were optimistic about a deal being reached before the election. Last week, for about a week's worth of time, Speaker Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin had been engaging in daily conversations and daily negotiations over a relief package. We had heard that while there were still lots of disagreements about exactly what should be in the bill, that they were coming together and talking about not just numbers, but also legislative language that would be needed in the bill. In an effort to try to put more pressure on the White House and more pressure on Republicans to negotiate for a bill, Speaker Pelosi brought a revised HEROES Act to the floor last week, which passed. Instead of being, her original proposal was $3.2 trillion. She reduced this proposal to $2.2 trillion, so she took $1 trillion off, in the hopes that that could help bring the two sides closer together to negotiate a deal. In that revised package, we saw a lot of really important housing resources that were still in there. That package was intended or is intended to provide state and local governments with resources through basically February 2021. So an extension of the unemployment benefits, another round of stimulus checks, other resources. It included about $50 billion in emergency rental assistance and $5 billion for people experiencing homelessness. And while that's about half of what we had been asking for, that shorter time frame means that they scaled back some of those investments. That gives us, if that were to pass, that would give not only communities some urgently needed resources, but it would also provide us and our congressional champions another opportunity to fight for the remaining resources that are needed early next year. So in response to that revised package, Mnuchin came back with his own offer from the White House. That was about $1.6 trillion. So still about $700 billion off from what Democrats had asked. There's still a big difference between the two. But we had heard very positive things about what that would mean for housing resources. We know that Mnuchin's offer, or we believe based on reporting, that Mnuchin's offer would have included about $50 billion for both mortgage relief and rent relief, but that wasn't too far off from the Democratic revised proposal of $71 billion, 50 for rental assistance and 21 for mortgage assistance. So we were really hopeful that that was a starting point for coming to a common ground on that proposal. In those negotiations, we weren't so certain about where things lie with resources for people experiencing homelessness or the moratorium. Those have taken, they just weren't publicized in the press, and so it was a little harder to get details about what that looked like. But right now, we're in a complete state of chaos and confusion. Lots of things are changing on a daily basis. After the president contracted coronavirus, a lot of attention was shifted towards that rather than on the relief package, although Speaker Pelosi and Mnuchin were continuing to meet and have these conversations. And then last night we saw, or yesterday we saw, that the president instructed Mnuchin to stop negotiations with Nancy Pelosi, really stopping everything from happening and moving forward. It's really confusing as to why he would want to stop those negotiations. From everything we had heard, the White House was very eager to get a relief package done. So it's a little confusing why they would change course. But then today we hear rumblings that maybe things are starting up again or not. So we're in a really confusing period where I don't think anyone really knows exactly what's going to happen. All of that's to say that us as advocates really need to keep up our efforts to contact our members of Congress and to let them know what the needs are in our communities. We don't know what's going to happen on the Hill. We don't know when negotiations are going to restart. We can't predict that. It's very hard, especially nowadays, to be able to give a prediction that lasts for more than 24 hours because things are changing so quickly. But that means that it's really on us as advocates to make sure that we're being very consistent in educating our members of Congress about the needs in our communities and the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness and low-income renters. So I will open it up to see if folks have any questions about what's happening in DC around this relief package or what that means for Utah.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. And actually, while you're speaking a few minutes ago, I just checked Washington Post to see if it's anything new, but it's kind of still, we don't know yet. The messages are very chaotic coming from the White House. So Jennifer asked a question, and I think this is right in the beginning when you mentioned the high number of people that might get evicted in the next year. Can you repeat the number of people that might lose their house or be evicted?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is based on research that our organization did with other academic institutions and other researchers. We looked at the Census Bureau data, which is their pulse survey, which they've been doing to see how many people either missed their last month's rent or mortgage payment and how many have little or no confidence that they'll be able to pay next month's rent. And based on those numbers, we estimated that 30 to 40 million households, 30 to 40 million renters would be at risk of losing their homes by the time the CDC moratorium ends at the end of the year. It's also really important to know that people are continuing to accumulate back rent right now, even despite the moratorium that's in place. And so there are lots of different estimates that are out there. Mark Zandi estimates that renters already owe about $25 billion in back rent, and that they could owe as much as $70 billion by the end of the year. Other organizations like the National Council of State Housing Agencies, which we shared a link to the report, estimates that renters could owe about $35 billion by the end of the year in back rent. It's very unclear right now. There's not a lot of good data out there. So everyone's trying to use the best data, make the best estimates about what the potential harm is. I see here you're sharing information about Utah, which is great to hear.
Right. So this is a report that actually I found about it through the memo to members that your organization sends every Monday. So this is a research done by Stout, and I posted the link in the chat box. So basically, between 40 to 60,000 renters might be able to pay their rent by the end of the year, and we might see 40,000 evictions in January 2021, which is 120 million to 166 million dollars. So these are pretty frightening numbers. And there are more people who posted questions, so I just wanted to share this information with you all. And then another question also again from Jennifer. She got information. I got information to direct people to PLAutah.org resources to get in the letter of the moratorium so they cannot be evicted. Is that the right website? So Jennifer, yeah, and the reason is, that's People's Legal Aid, Sarah. This is a new organization in our state that it should have been around, many moons ago, but finally, they came together as a nonprofit and they represent low-income renters. And I think the income limitation is they have to be below 400% of the poverty level, so that covers a lot of people. And they also help people who might not be documented, which is something I think the Utah Legal Services cannot help, if I'm not mistaken. So going back to Jennifer, so the reason the way we do the outreach for the CDC moratorium is this. So we are sending people to the Utah courts because the Utah courts, and they have, it's a credible institution and they have a lot of good information. We do have information on our website that I shared previously in the chat with, the link to the HUD 20 languages form. I have links to the National Income Housing Coalition, because the National Income Housing Coalition, not only they have the action declaration, but they have talking points, what this means. So this is very good for people to understand. And we recommend people to use the CDC form on the People Legal Aid website, because when that form, it's signed by the tenant and they're just using the smartphone, they put the landlord's email there. So the form will going to go directly to the landlord, and also the People Legal Aid has a copy of it, because the other thing of this whole CDC moratorium, not only that it has to be triggered by the tenant, so the tenant has to go and give it, but you need to have proof, and the best way is to have electronic proof. So either an email or you have this website that keeps a copy of it. So that's why we are sending people there, Jennifer. And if you need additional information, please give us a call and I'll be happy to talk to you. We have a question from Margarita Sacchini. Do you Do you happen to have okay. Do you happen to have disaggregate data looking for Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, Asian Americans, etc.?
So it's actually really difficult to disaggregate the data, and that's because a lot of these different reports are using the Census Pulse survey, which is that survey that the census has been using weekly to figure out how many people are missing their rent payments or aren't very confident about paying their next month's rent payments. But their sample size is pretty small, and so that makes it very difficult to go. You can get numbers of the racial disparities at the national level, but once you get to the state level, we don't recommend that people break it down like that because there's just not enough data to be certain about the outcomes. So I will share what we do know. What we do know is that in July, when the census data was last collected with their old survey, 21% of adults either missed their last housing payment or had little to no confidence about paying their next month's payment. But 21% really obscures, that number obscures the racial dynamics that are at play here. 44% of Black renters, 41% of Latino renters. I don't have the numbers for Asian Americans as you're asking for. We saw much higher rates of housing insecurity among Black and Latino renters than we did among white renters. So there's a clear disparity that's happening here. The other information that we have that would point to racial disparities is in comparing job loss among different households. And what we've seen, or what reports have shown, is that for many white households, the unemployment rate has largely returned back to the pre-pandemic level, whereas so that the entire economic job loss at this current point is falling on people of color, which means that you're seeing much harsher economic outcomes and economic burdens on people of color right now. That makes, that compounds with what we have known about the housing crisis pre-pandemic, where people of color were already disproportionately likely to be low income, more likely to be cost burdened by their housing costs, and more likely to be experiencing homelessness. So what we're seeing is a crisis on a crisis, and a crisis that has racial disparities happening on top of each other too. So it's really producing really stark outcomes for people of color. But I don't recommend using the Pulse data to get down much further to your statewide level because of the small sample size.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And just to give you a little bit of background information about what's been happening in Utah. So the Latino community and the Pacific Islander community, even if as percentage of the population is small, because Utah is pretty much a white state, they have very high numbers of COVID cases. And so for people who work in the community, for advocates, for organizers, this has been such a heartbreaking issue. And you look at the Latino community, some of them are undocumented and they are afraid to receive any kind of help, because they are just afraid. And it's, we understand, especially under this administration. So, we also have seen, evictions in that community, and it's just a number of issues that are happening on the ground. And, a lot of, immigrants are essential workers, and they could not afford to work from home. They have to go to work. And, they got sick, and sometimes they even, spread the virus within their family, intergenerational households.
Yeah.
We have
thank you.
Go ahead.
I just want to say thank you so much for asking that question, because there's a clear hypocrisy here of, upholding essential workers, thanking them for their work, but then leaving those same workers behind when it comes to making sure that their health and their housing needs are met. I think it points to really deep structural racism and deep structural inequities that we really have to address after we address this. You know, we need to address this most urgent pandemic, but we have to be able to shift focus and to really tackle these underlying issues, because otherwise, the next time we have a pandemic or the next time we have an economic crisis, we're going to be in the same position over again, where, again, the harm is disproportionately falling on immigrants and people of color and other marginalized populations.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, we tackled those issues when we had our conference at the beginning of the month. And, you know, Margarita and I had several conversations, and I think most people agree, you know, that 2020 was such a hard year. And out of this crazy year, something good is coming, which is we have a lot of conversation, like serious conversations about how to address, you know, institutionalized racism. And I see it as a positive thing to really start working on this. Rob has a question about mortgages. Do you have
I see
stats?
that he asked.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Sorry, he's asking about whether or not we have stats on missed or at-risk mortgage payments. And so I wanted to be clear that the census data that I cited earlier combines both rent and mortgage payments. So it's really hard to suss out and to get more details about exactly who is at risk. I will say that there is, I think, based on what we know about the income levels of people who are most harmed by COVID, we and others understand that this crisis is mostly hitting renters, but it is definitely still hitting especially low-income homeowners who might also be working in the same industries that are seeing job losses. But no, I don't have data that breaks out the mortgage payments from rent payments.
Yeah,
but that's a great question.
And Rob, you know, Utah Community Action Agency, who serves Salt Lake County and Tooele County, I think they serve the most people in the state. The last call we had with them, I think, was last Thursday. They started getting calls about mortgage assistance. So it started to happen. And on the other hand, we have to remember, you know, mobile home and manufactured homeowners, which are, you know, they have mortgages on their home. They're not traditional mortgages, but it's still a mortgage, a loan they have to pay. And then they have the lot rent. So that's the other, you know, when we think about low income homeowners, you know, yes, manufactured homeowners. Susan has a question. Do we know how much CARES Act rental assistance is left in Utah? So Susan, at the moment, I do not know. I know that some people from the state are on this call, and somebody raised their hand. Let's see who raised their hand. Brandy. I'm gonna let Brandy speak, but Susan, I mean, Jess Peterson is on this call, and he is with, you know, the state Olin Walker Housing Loan Fund. Maybe he's able to give us an update, but at this moment, I do not know. Brandy, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I'm Brandy Farmer and president of Centro Cívico Mexicano. We just opened up affordable housing for active seniors, Casa Milagros in Salt Lake City. But I also work for Salt Lake County Health Department, and yes, one of the things that we're seeing a lot of, and that is that you know, especially in the undocumented community, we are seeing a lot of the, you know, the COVID. What happens is that a family member gets it, they lose their jobs, they lose their housing, and then they move in with other family members, and then and so, you know, COVID then becomes rampant within their. So we, you know, we're finding. I can't, you know, speak for Salt Lake County Health Department, but what I'm hearing from the Hispanic community, we've got 21 people living in one housing unit. And so anyway, so when we talk about funding for affordable housing, is there any money that's available for people, you know, that need housing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that I have to think back at it, I can share some resources after the call to make sure that you get it. What I know is about the emergency rental assistance that we are pushing for, and that was in the HEROES Act, that money does not have any restrictions, or let me back up and say this is more clear. That money can be used to provide assistance to people who are undocumented. In order for that to be the case, it has to be distributed through a nonprofit organization rather than a local agency, government agency. But we are very careful about who we share that information with, because we know that if we were to highlight that with Hill staff or with other folks, we could very well see a fight on a relief package about whether or not those funds are restricted only to U.S. citizens. It is something that is ongoing in negotiations right now when it comes to stimulus checks. The first round of stimulus checks did not go to people who are undocumented, and in fact, it did not go to mixed status families either. That's something that's being negotiated, or was being negotiated, between Mnuchin and Speaker Pelosi. I don't know how that's going to turn out, but we are very weary about having that fight on the housing side. So we're very cautious about sharing that information. I don't believe there is any restrictions from the federal government on coronavirus relief funds from the CARES Act. Those dollars could be used to serve people who are undocumented. But what we've often seen is that states add additional requirements above and beyond what is in the federal statute. And many states are requiring that people provide Social Security numbers in order to access those funds, which would mean that undocumented people are barred from receiving that assistance. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag about what resources are available and what resources are not available. But we're hearing the same issue, that it's very concerning. Undocumented people are also not eligible for unemployment insurance in most cases, which means that the major sources of direct assistance that was in the CARES Act largely overlook people who are undocumented, which puts them in a more precarious position.
And I just have one more thing that I want to tell you, and that is that we're finding, like some of the family members that are passing away with, unexpected deaths and debt because there's no funeral expenses. So that also adds to their predicament, in being able to pay for housing. So I just wanted to let you know that it's just very, very emotional.
Yeah, you might want to look into whether or not FEMA resources can be used for that, actually. I believe so. In addition to the president declaring a public health emergency, we also saw approvals of major disaster declarations. So under the typical, as if it was like a hurricane or anything else. And I believe one of the resources that were made available is funeral expense support. So that might be a resource that the city and state and folks can look into. I'm not very familiar with that myself, but I do believe that it was approved under the major disaster declaration. So that is a tool you could look into.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Brandy, I'm gonna reach out to the FEMA person that works on the ground. He's actually, we were colleagues in college. We're together, University of Utah, and we've been checking in once in a while because that's a good resource to have. Karen McCandles posted in Q&A that the bulk of money they have to help rental assistance, a community action in Provo, can be used to assist undocumented family, and these are CARES money. The only money they have to assist with mortgages is FEMA, and that's only one-time help. So that's kind of region by region. So as far as I know, Salt Lake City government provided mortgage assistance funds to 2 nonprofits within Salt Lake City, that's NeighborWorks Salt Lake and CDC, to do mortgage assistance. I don't know right now what else is available, the rest of the county, but it seems like FEMA, it's one source of money. I don't know if anyone from the county is on the call and they can help us with that answer, but this is something that, we need to look into. The next question we have in the chat, CDBG CV funding can be used for funeral expenses, I believe, for low-income families. I was not aware of that.
Mhm.
Does anyone else has any more questions? I don't see anyone else. I think most of us wanted to know, what the heck is going on, when we're going to have some news about passing some legislation. We're all nervous. Election is coming up, and most of us were going to start receiving the mail ballots next week because everybody in Utah can vote by mail and it's safe. There are no issues about it. Angela Price says Salt Lake City is the only government, I guess, offering mortgage assistance. She just got an update from the county today with rent and mortgage assistance. Margarita has another question. So she says, we have people who aren't necessarily experiencing the primary effects of COVID, but are experiencing the secondary effects, but have no access to funding because they don't have COVID. That's also another issue. Like we've been talking about it in our outreach, because the CDC moratorium is so broad, because it can be applied that, if you don't have enough money to pay, but then the CARES Act money is tied to COVID, the rental assistance. So
that's an interesting case, because this is another place where we're seeing that states are interpreting the language more restrictively than what's written in the statute. Under the coronavirus relief funds, the only thing that needs to be proven is that the funds are necessary to respond to the pandemic. But there's a case to be made that keeping people in their homes, regardless of the reason why they're having trouble paying their rent, that is a tool to help prevent the spread of coronavirus, and the CDC moratorium really makes that argument clear. But we are seeing states interpret the CARES Act much more narrowly and requiring that renters show that there's a direct connection to COVID, which, is disappointing to see, but it is something that we're seeing across the board.
Yeah.
I see a question from Susan asking about how we know about the institutional landlords that are moving towards eviction if eviction rates themselves haven't gone up. So there is not a national database of eviction data. That's a major shortfall. And in fact, prior to the pandemic, we were working on legislation to start collecting that data. And this really points to why it's so important to have it. This information comes from different researchers that are out there. So we know that Eviction Lab, which is run by Matthew Desmond, who wrote the book Evicted, he has been tracking eviction filings in about 16 metropolitan areas and is showing a decline in evictions overall. The way we know that institutional landlords are moving forward with evictions is based on research from another partner, another organization, private equity stakeholders group. I might be getting the name a little wrong, but they've been following eviction filings among those really largest corporate landlords, and they have found a sharp increase in their filings. And so there's not a ton of great comprehensive data that is out there, but the data we do have shows that those, especially those largest of landlords, are moving forward with evictions at a very high rate, even higher than they were doing before the CDC moratorium was announced.
And Sarah, just from the data perspective, we are looking at creating, there's already an existing eviction dashboard that we're going to be extended statewide. So there's going to be more information. And yes, evictions are still happening. We have seen a switch from non-payment of rent to nuisance. And the other trend that we've seen in Utah, so in Utah, we don't have those major corporate landlords that they tend to be on the East Coast. But what we have seen in Utah is lease terminations. And in some places is one family or two families, but we have seen, I think, at least 4 or 5 instances this summer where a whole building received lease termination. In some cases, the building in the avenues, probably they're gonna, fix it up and sell it as luxury apartments. In other situation in South Salt Lake, they gave notice to mostly refugees who live there, and they have large families, so it's a little difficult to find them new place. And that building will gonna be demolished, and they're gonna build something else. So basically, we call them mass evictions during the pandemic. We also have seen the mobile home park getting closed in Centerville. So, and for anyone, Susan, and for anyone who's interested in this, Utah Housing Coalition, we're gonna make public, in the next month or so, kind of the work that we've been doing, addressing specifically evictions and rental assistance and what we are trying to achieve. I know that Jennifer, I think it was Jennifer, asked questions about if the CDC, Community Development Corporation of Utah, and NeighborWorks Salt Lake, if they still have money for mortgage assistance. I don't know about that, but I think it's best if you call them and find out. I just don't know that.
Can we go back to, I want to go back to your question about, I think you're bringing up, folks on this call are bringing up really good examples of how protections from the CDC moratorium are very uneven. And part of that is because courts are interpreting the moratorium very differently from one another. So what we've seen is that maybe in one jurisdiction, a court is reading it really broadly to protect renters. One county over, we could see a completely different reading of the moratorium. It is really important for folks who are working with households that are in need. If you have questions about who's covered and why and what documentation is needed, to reach out to legal aid attorneys so that they can provide you with the best information. We haven't, the National Local Housing Coalition, our partners at the National Housing Law Project, have interpreted the CDC moratorium to apply not just to eviction for non-payment of rent, but also lease terminations. And so it'd be helpful for folks to be in close contact with legal aid attorneys about how to make the best case for your clients or make the best case for low-income renters, because there is a lot of disparity in how it's being interpreted, and but that also provides legal aid attorneys with the opportunity to make a good case for why the protections should be as broad as possible.
Right. And just the other day, the Utah Supreme Court published new rules on how cases have to take place during a pandemic, addressing internet issues or slow speed internet. And one issue that I addressed, and I'm still trying to figure out, this is in unlawful detainer cases, which eviction cases. I think the landlord / plaintiff, they have to follow COVID relief bills or rules, something like that. So I read that as they need to follow the CDC moratorium, but we in our ad hoc groups, we're going to be talking about this tomorrow, and I'm going to find out a little bit more what actually means. But so far, I heard from the people who represent low-income renters in court that once they're able to give the tenant that declaration form, yes, the judge is accepting it and the case is moved. So, so we don't, so far so good, we don't have, I know that they are challenging the law I think in 3 different cases across the country. So this was a really, really good conversation. And the great thing about it is that you, Sarah, kind of have the national view, but you kind of get to hear directly what's been happening on the ground. And, you know, the information that we're able to provide you, it goes back to the work that you do. And, you know, we as a coalition, we always, when we put action alerts, you know, contact your elected officials or contact your federal representative. You know, in National Income Housing Coalition has a form that you can put your name as an individual, or if you have the authority, you can list your organization if you're an executive director. So, you know, people who are on this call and people who are going to listen to this later, they have, you know, you, first of all, you are a constituent, number one. Then you are your organization. So you can ask Senator Romney and Senator Lee to support the relief packages related to housing, because, you know, in Utah, we don't have state rental assistance. Every help that we get is coming from the Congress. So it's really important to, you know, let them know how important the federal money is in Utah. Because if it wasn't for the CARES Act money, you know, if it wasn't for the HUD money, we had been in really big trouble. So that's, you know, something to always to think about. I'm looking at the chat. There are no other questions. If I missed your question, please put it in the chat now, and I apologize if I did. There have been some information shared in the Q&A, and I think we answered to all of them. Yes, CDC and Neighbor Works Lake still have money for mortgage assistance, so that's important. And, you know, in the near future, and who knows, maybe even tomorrow, you know, if we have action alerts, you know, for you to call the Congress, or if anything new happens prior to election related to housing, we're going to let you know. We're going to keep you informed. I'd like to thank Sarah so much for taking, you know, almost an hour out of her time. Sarah's a very busy person, and we're so grateful to have her. National Income Housing Coalition, we are partners, and we urge you to become partners as well. The communication and the information and the research we get from them is unbelievable, and truly we rely so much on them, and we thank you for all you do for all of us, for the rest of the country. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good Wednesday, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.